On February 19th, 2005, Danielle Imbo had plans for a fun evening. Her partner Richard had asked if she wanted to join him for a night on the town, to which she agreed. What seemed like an innocent evening on the town would turn into one of the most infamous cold cases in Philadelphia, and perhaps the nation. Danielle was just 34 years old when she vanished along with her partner, Richard Petrone, 35, on that cold winter evening, and the two have not been seen or heard from since. There's been no activity on their bank accounts, ATM cards, or cell phones, and both their families still seek answers as to where their loved ones have gone. South Street in Philadelphia is a highlight of the city, not only to the many tourists that flock to the city throughout the year, but to locals as well. The street stretches several blocks, and it's lined with various eateries, bars, clubs, head shops, adult boutiques, and entertainment venues. If you're in search of anything, it's a good bet that you can find it on South Street. For both Danielle and Richard, South Street was a common place to hang out. Danielle had formerly fronted a local band and sang on the weekends, with a lot of gigs bringing her to that part of the city. Everyone close to Danielle describes her exactly the same, perhaps the nicest person you'll ever meet. She was full of life and could light up a room. Danielle was recently separated from her second husband, Joe Imbo, and had reconnected with a former classmate, Richard Petrone. The two had known each other since they were 15, Danielle being close with Richard's sister, Christine. She had even had a crush on Richard, but he was too busy with sports to notice, and so their paths went different ways until they were older. Both Danielle and Richard had children of their own. Danielle shared custody with her ex-husband, Joe Imbo, who was stated to have abandoned his wife and child when Danielle had an affair. Richard raised his daughter as a single parent, living in the apartment above the bakery his family owned and operated. Richard had worked at the bakery most of his life and was the chief decorator, handling all the wedding cakes that came through Viking Bakery, located just outside Philadelphia, in Ardmore. When Richard's daughter decided she wanted to move in with her mother in South Philadelphia, Richard packed up and moved to the neighborhood so he could be closer to her. It was here he and Danielle found themselves in each other's gaze and rekindled the romance that had been left behind, all those years ago. Danielle had been in a rough spot with her now ex-husband. Before the two finally separated, Danielle seemed to be a different person, chain-smoking and weighing just 85 pounds. When the two finally called it quits, life seemed to come back to Danielle, and she seemed to be finding balance in her life. However, what seemed to everyone else as bliss wasn't exactly what Danielle was experiencing. Danielle, being married and separated twice, had little intentions of ever being married again. But that is exactly what Richard wanted. Danielle had spoken with friends about ending the relationship with Richard, stating the two wanted different things, and she eventually did inform him of this. Joe Imbo had also been invading Danielle's new relationship with Richard, trying to get her back. There were several disputes between Richard and Joe, and while it is believed the two never met face to face, there were phone calls and threats from Joe to show up at the bakery and beat Richard with a bat. Danielle couldn't take the stress of being fought over, her ex trying to pull her back into an unhappy marriage, and her new flame trying to make her settle into a new marriage and start a new life with him. It was all too much for Danielle to handle, and she finally broke it off with Richard shortly before the evening of February 19th. Nonetheless, when Richard asked her to join him on that evening, she obliged. One could assume it would be difficult for Danielle to separate completely from Richard, as she was so close to his family. His sister was one of her best friends and even did her hair. Richard obviously didn't want to end things with Danielle, but also knew she didn't want the same things he did. Relationships like this could be tricky, and perhaps Richard just wanted to continue having Danielle in his life, regardless if they were married or not, and by her accepting his invitation, it would seem Danielle was comfortable with keeping Richard in her life as well. She just needed her space. On that fateful evening, Danielle had gotten a ride from her condo in Mount Laurel, New Jersey to meet up with her mother, Christine, and Richard's mother, Marge, for dinner. Richard had started his evening at a local bar where Danielle would either be dropped off by Christine or picked up after dinner by Richard. This part is unclear, but Christine states in interviews she dropped Danielle off, while most online articles say she was picked up by Richard. Regardless of this, the pair had decided to visit a local venue, the Abilene, where they hosted live music every night of the week. The two had wanted to see a band perform and met up with a pair of Richard's friends, Anthony Valentino and Michelle McLaughlin. By all accounts, the evening was uneventful, with the group enjoying the music and having drinks. There was no report of any disputes, quarrels, or anything out of the ordinary. When leaving, Richard had stated that he had found a parking spot nearby, and the two left the venue around 11:30 to 11:45. No one knows exactly where Richard had parked his 1991 Dodge Dakota, and after leaving the venue, they have not been seen since. Like into thin air, the pair mysteriously vanished without a trace. It was early the next day that some alarm bells were raised. Danielle had a hair appointment with Christine at 11 a.m., and she never showed, which was very unlike her. Attempts to contact her failed, and the same for Richard, his cell phone being shut off. Richard's mother, Marge, tried several times on both his cell phone and landline, to no avail. This, of course, gave reason for concern, as Richard was always sure to make himself available for his daughter, never having his phone off. He was also supposed to be home with friends watching the Daytona 500, but they were also unable to get in touch with him. When the pair was unreachable after 24 hours, both the New Jersey and Philadelphia police were notified, but both families wasted no time attempting to search for the couple. A missing persons flyer was created, being handed out and plastered all over the South Street area. Volunteers searched the nearby wooded areas in New Jersey, combed the parking lot of the Philadelphia airport, and looked through the local swamp in Tinicum Township, but no sign of the couple was ever found. Soon, the police turned their attention to the Delaware River, the natural boundary between the city and New Jersey, thinking the car could be submerged. This was no small undertaking, as the Delaware is quite large, and has several different bridges that lead to Jersey. From South Street to Mount Laurel, New Jersey, any one of the three bridges could be a viable route. The Walt Whitman, Ben Franklin, and Betsy Ross bridges all being a possible way back to Danielle's condo. The car careening off the bridge would be easily noticeable, but there are several places on the way to and from these bridges that the car could have entered the water. Several vehicles were located in the Delaware, but none belonging to Richard, leaving investigators stumped. Eyes quickly turned towards Danielle's ex-husband as a possible suspect in the pair's disappearance. Joe Imbo, however, had a solid alibi, telling detectives he had spent the night at a family friend's house with his son, in Toms River, New Jersey, over 60 miles from Philadelphia. He was joined by his mother and stepfather as well, solidifying his whereabouts for the evening. One might even say his alibi is far too good, being surrounded by family and friends, two of which, his stepfather Mike Cuomo, family friend Alex Schreier, both being retired law enforcement. It was easy for people to doubt Imbo's claims, saying his family was protecting him, so to satisfy the public, he took a polygraph, with the results being inconclusive. Naturally, the reports of Joe threatening Richard were brought into question, but Joe claims that never happened. Within years of the disappearance, Joe moved out of state, having full custody of his son. The idea has been tossed around of it possibly being a contracted hit, set in motion by Joe Imbo in an attempt to gain custody of the child. While on the surface this can seem like a far-fetched idea, is it really hard to believe? A trained professional with the know-how, manpower, and funds to make two people disappear along with their vehicle certainly wouldn't be impossible. Not to mention the heavy influence of the Philadelphia mob, which at the time, and still to this day, has a heavy influence in the area, and with Joe Imbo having significant connections to law enforcement, it has all the ingredients of the perfect crime. A padded alibi only solidifies this belief, but with no evidence or information to go on, it's only wild speculation. Another possible scenario was laid out by the police, suspecting it could have been a random attack, an unknown assailant targeting Danielle and Richard for some reason. However, targeting a couple in a 3,000-pound truck would not seem like an ideal crime of opportunity, and a lot of work. Certainly not impossible, but not an easy task to make all three disappear. At the time, there was a lot of car theft in Philadelphia, and police think the car could have been boosted and sold to a chop shop or discarded after the crime in a car shredder. However, the belief that any one person assisting in the dismantling or disposing of a large vehicle wouldn't come forward for the $100,000 reward in the case would be a hard one. $100,000 is certainly more tempting than a 15-year-old vehicle sold piece by piece. The other possible scenario is that Danielle and Richard decided to run away and leave their lives behind to start anew. This again is hard to believe. Both Danielle and Richard love their children. There is little to no possibility that the two would decide to abandon their children together. Richard was a hard-working man who raised his daughter as a single parent, working every day to provide for her, even moving his life and distance to work just to be closer to her. Danielle's son was still young, and she had worked tirelessly in the custody battle to make sure that she had equal visitation along with her ex-husband. Both authorities and family think this scenario is highly unlikely. Taking a deeper dive into the evening in question, it is Polygraph's belief that the couple found themselves in an accident, and the car was then submerged. However, where exactly that might be is tough to say. As stated before, Richard was to drive Danielle home to Mount Laurel, New Jersey. It is possible that plans could have changed and the couple ended up back at Richards, but Danielle had a hair appointment the next day in New Jersey, and with the recent separation, we have to assume Richard drove Danielle back to her condo. From South Street, each of the 3 bridges could have been used to get her back home, but all take very different routes. Mount Laurel is almost directly west across the Delaware from South Street. The closest option would most likely be taking the Ben Franklin Bridge. However, just because it's the closest doesn't necessarily mean it would be the fastest or easiest. Getting to the Ben Franklin from South Street involves driving through the city, multiple one-way streets, red lights, and a heavy police presence. It's unknown if Richard was under the influence that evening, but one can assume if he had had one too many libations, he'd want to take a road less traveled. Perhaps Richard had thought of this and decided on the second best option, which would be taking the Walt Whitman Bridge into Jersey. Getting to the Walt Whitman from South Street might be a bit more straightforward and perhaps less traffic, but certainly further out of the way, adding about 15 to 20 minutes additional travel time to the destination going this roundabout way. What could be the fastest and easiest route, surprisingly, is taking the Betsy Ross, which would be the furthest from South Street, but is almost all exclusively on the highway. In fact, the difference between taking the Ben Franklin versus the Betsy Ross is about 1 to 2 minutes, almost identical travel times, despite the Betsy Ross being further upriver. Without knowing exactly what route they took, it's difficult to try and figure out which body of water they could have ended up in. In the past few years, the YouTube team Adventures with Purpose has taken it upon themselves to check multiple bodies of water in and around the area, along the multiple roads home. However, each search has ended without any significant developments, which again begs the question, did they really end up in the water, or did someone make them disappear? There could be several other possibilities that one could think up. There has been accusations of the couple being involved in a prescription drug ring, prostitution, and smuggling operations, all of which seem to have little to no validity to them, which is why they were not included in this investigation. The fact of the matter in this case is that 2 people disappeared into the night, with 0 physical evidence. They have literally fallen off the face of the earth, leaving no trace of where they went after leaving the Abilene on February 19, 2005. For almost 20 years, family, friends, law enforcement, and volunteers have scoured the area and bodies of water looking for any trace of the couple. Until there is a single piece of physical evidence in this case, the disappearance of Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone will remain unsolved. If you or anyone you know has any information as to the whereabouts of Danielle or Richard, please contact the Philadelphia Police Tip Line at 215-546-TIPS or the local FBI field office at 215-418-4000. Until then, Polygraph investigates.